They call me the wild rose, but my name never lies a day.
Hey, what's up everybody? This is LA Knight, and I am here to review the book Naked in Death by JD Robb. JD Robb is actually the pseudonym that Nora Roberts used when she first began the In Death series back in 1994, because since she had already made a name for herself as a romance novelist, her publisher was concerned that her books wouldn't sell, the new ones, because people would think,
Oh, well, she's a woman and she writes romance novels. What does she know about writing crime thrillers, crime dramas, whatever?
and so that's why she came up with the name JD Robb. So everyone assumed for a long time that JD Robb was actually a dude. And then it came out, I believe, around book 15, because all the books were New York Times bestsellers, that JD Robb was actually Nora Roberts. For those of you who don't know, Nora Roberts is one of the names in romance, the genre, right now. She's written, I want to say, at least 150 novels. Actually, it's got to be at least 150, because there's 45 in-depth novels just by themselves. And then she had written 50 or so romance novels before she even started writing the in-depth series back 20 years ago. So yeah, the series has been going on for 20 years. So, she's one of the romance novelists in America. I don't want to say in the world, but she very well may be. I just don't actually know, so I'm not going to claim that she is. So the In-Death series, the basic premise is it's a series of mysteries, almost all of them involving murder. There's a couple that don't, but almost all of them involving murder, that are investigated by Yves Dallas. She's a homicide detective in the year 2058. And, nowadays it's oh, well, it's 2017, 2058, it's only 40 years from now, which is still a long time, but it's not that long. But back in 1994, that was a long time in the future. And also they've only made it to, I think, 2061 at this point in the series, because each book only spans a few weeks, and that's why there are so many. And Eve has to solve these crimes while also, she ends up falling in love. She deals with a lot of personal trauma that happened to her that she'd never dealt with before. She has to widen her circle of friends, because she only has, the one friend at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of the first book. And, blah, 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 lots of things happen. And so it's very interesting, because, the focus is always on the mystery itself, but then it's nice and it's kind of fun to see Eve interact with all these people that she knows, and they're also different and they're also interesting. So, the first book, specifically, Naked in Death, each book is called something in death. So, there's Naked in Death, Glory in Death, Immortal in Death, Rapture in Death, Ceremony in Death. That's the first 5 books. The only book in the series that doesn't have in death in the title is From New York to Dallas, for some reason. Maybe because she couldn't come up with a title that would fit with, in death in it. I don't know. So, in the first book, Naked in Death, Eve is investigating the murder of a prostitute, and this is in a time when prostitution has become legal, actually. So they're not called prostitutes anymore, they're called licensed companions. Unlicensed companions are prostitutes who are not registered with the government. It's it's not a government job, but basically you have to have a license. You have to get screened every so often. But it's basically they've legalized sex work, because when they did that, a lot of the crime that happened to sex workers went way down. Which actually, I think they proved in some other country in Europe that that's actually how that works, but I could be wrong. Anyway, so a prostitute is murdered, and she's investigating the murder. Turns out that this homicide is a little trickier than it would be normally, because this girl who was killed is the granddaughter of a senator who's, the next election, going to be running for president. And so, in the course of her investigation, she comes across some really interesting and very dark and terrible family secrets about this senator's family. And then she also runs into this guy named Rourke, who's he's basically the Bill Gates of this world, except that he's only 30, and he's a super genius when it comes to computers, and he's super hot, and he's also super Irish. So I listen to the audiobooks, and the lady who does the narration is really good at voices. And so you wouldn't know that that's a woman doing Rourke's voice, and she does his accent super great. And she ends up meeting Rourke, who ends up then being a suspect in the murder, and so then there's this whole conflict of interest thing going on, because on the one hand, Eve is in her gut, she's pretty sure that Rourke didn't actually kill the girl, but then, she has to follow procedure, and it turns into this whole big thing. They end up finding out who killed and also 2 other prostitutes are murdered during the investigation. So she finds out who killed them all. She ends up getting a cat out of this, and her and Rourke end up falling in love, and it's really interesting. It's very obvious this book was written in 1994. So here's the thing. This book has a lot of triggers in it, first of all. So I'm going to say if you are triggered by sexual abuse, you cannot read this book. You find out that Yves was sexually abused as a child. This is a recurring thread throughout the series because she has refused to cope with this in a healthy way, and she's finally pushed herself to the point that she either has to start coping with it appropriately or she's going to burn out and something bad is going to happen. She's just not going to be able to handle her life anymore because being a homicide detective is very draining anyway. I mean, you're surrounded by all the cases you couldn't solve, all the people you couldn't help, all the people that you did get justice for, but they're still dead. So if you can't handle if you're triggered by sexual abuse, then this book is not for you. This is a thing that happens a lot. You find out, here's where we get to the spoilers, you find out that Sharon, the first girl who died, the reason that she died was because the guy who killed her, she was blackmailing him so that nobody would find out that he molested her as a child. And there's incest because it turns out it's her grandfather, the guy who's going to run for president. He dies, though, so, fuck him. Good for him, he dies. Yay. There's actually two killers. The second killer also dies. And good riddance to him, too. I think he dies. They figure out who did it, obviously. The thing is that, literature has really evolved in the last 20 years. I would say in the last 30, 40 years, actually. But really, it's really taken off, especially in young adult. This is not a young adult novel. This is an adult novel. But especially in young adult, but also in, paranormal romance and stuff. And most paranormal romances have, some kind of murder mystery going on or some kind of, crime thing happening. And you can see the difference between this first book that she wrote and books that she has written since then. It's the same difference you would see in other books that came out at that time versus books that are coming out now. So when I've actually read this book when I was 21, right after I got married. I think my grandma recommended it to me. Her and my mom have been reading these books since they came out. Of course, I was 5 when the first one came out, so obviously I wasn't reading that. But there are things in the first book, that when I first read it, I didn't realize were there. That now that I'm more aware of what is and is not acceptable in the real world, and how how media, books and movies, affect the real world and how they are affected by the real world. Now that I have reread it and with this awareness in me, I can see that there are things in it that I didn't realize were there before. And so originally, when I first read it, I checked on Goodreads. My rating was 5 stars, and when I reread it, it dropped to 3 stars. And the reason why is because there's a lot of stuff in it that I really feel doesn't need to be in it, but I also think is a product of the time. As an example, Yves is very dismissive of anything that is stereotypically feminine. She doesn't like dressing up. She doesn't like makeup. She doesn't like any of those things. But the other thing is that unless her best friend Mavis is doing those things, she doesn't like it when other women do it either. She makes disparaging comments, and this goes away as the books go on, and I think it's because Nora Roberts actually learned, maybe people brought this up to her, or maybe she learned that she didn't have to be this way. It could be actually that the reason she wrote Yves this way is because at the time you couldn't have a novel with a female protagonist in this kind of career who didn't do this. You also see this in the Anita Blake series, which is the supernatural version of the In-Death series. There's murders, but instead of it being in the year 2058, instead it's modern day, well, at the time, it was the 90s, with vampires and werewolves. But Anita is exactly the same way. She doesn't like dressing up, she doesn't like quote-unquote girly things, and she disparages other women when they do those things. Unlike JD Robb, Laurel K. Hamilton has not learned that this is not okay. So Yves is very disparaging of other women, However, she's also very disparaging of men, too. She's basically disparaging of everybody, so maybe it's actually a personality trait, but specifically with women, she goes after them on a physical level. She, like, nitpicks at, and not, like, out loud, but mentally she makes derogatory comments about, you know, when women dress up, when they put on makeup, when they do their hair. Like, you know, there's a lot of incredulity in her about the fact that women dress up. Like, she has this, why the hell would you ever wear that kind of attitude, and it's very negative. It's like, it's not in a funny way, it's very negative. The only time she is in any way positive in the first book is about this sort of thing is with her friend Mavis. Mavis dresses like Lady Gaga. And so basically, instead of being like, well, you know, it's okay for Mavis to be girly, like, this is Mavis being girly, instead, Eve is like, okay, this is Mavis being Mavis, but, you know, nobody else can do it. So it's a very narrow window of what is acceptable and who it's acceptable to be done by. And, you know, when I was first reading this, because this was the kind of thing that I read a lot, because I've been reading a lot of old mysteries at that point, and by old I mean, like, came out in the 90s, and a lot of the female leads are just like that. The women that they deal with are shown in very negative ways. Now, and this actually, but the thing is, again, JD Robb fixes this. I always say JD Robb because it takes me a minute to remember that she's Nora Roberts. Nora Roberts fixes this as the series goes on, because actually a lot of the women that you meet in the first book that Eve is very disparaging of, she actually ends up later, like, backing off and being like, you know what, actually I was totally wrong and these people are actually really cool. Like, you meet Dr. Charlotte Mira. She's the psychiatrist who works with the police department. She, you know, her and Eve's relationship is very antagonistic in the first book, but it slowly they become really good friends, and Dr. Mira actually ends up becoming like a second mother to her. Dr. Mira's like 60, by the way, in case anyone's like, why not, you know, girlfriends? It's because Dr. Mira's like 60 years old. Eve is the age of her children. Eve makes friends over the course of the series with Nadine First, who's one of the top reporters for, you know, one of the local news stations, and in the first book, she's very dismissive of Nadine. She uses Nadine as, like, a tool to help further her investigation, but she doesn't like Nadine. And she is very dismissive of the way Nadine dresses, and the fact that she is, like, very focused on her appearance and stuff. Like, you know, it's just now that I'm, you know, super invested in the characters, I'm willing to overlook this when I reread the first few books. But if I was just getting into the series now, I would have a real issue with how mean Eve is mentally about a lot of the women in the series, except Mavis. So, like, on the one hand, I guess, like, this was one of those, you know, super feminist stepping stones for the early 90s, but now would not be considered very feminist. And I can see why. It's probably one of those necessary stepping stones when they were, you know, first trying to get female protagonists into the mainstream genre fiction, you know, marketplace. But, you know, at the same time, it's kind of annoying. Because I didn't even notice it because it's gone in most of the later books. You know, the further on you get in the series, the less she does this. And so I'd actually forgotten I didn't notice it was there, so I didn't realize it was there, and I'd forgotten how dismissive she could be until I was rereading the series, and I'm like, wow, I didn't notice this before, and it was kind of annoying, actually. I was like, damn. You know, like, stop it, Eve, these people are your friends. Cut it out. The other thing is that, the only black person you see in the first book is, like, who has any real lines, is this guy named Crack. His name's actually, like, William, I think, but you don't find this out until, like, book 16. But his name is Crack, and I really like his character, but I didn't realize at the time that I read it that he's actually kind of the stereotype. He's this really big black guy who's a bouncer at a sex club. And, like, if there were other black people in the book, this wouldn't be so bad, but, you know, it kind of sucks. Like, later, he's actually a recurring character. He keeps coming back in the series, and there are other black people in the series, actually starting in book 2. So this is actually only a problem in book 1, which actually makes me wonder if it was more the publishing market at the time that forced her to, you know, edge out other black characters and only have this one character until they saw how popular the book was going to be. I actually don't know. I don't know for a fact. A lot of the authors that I read, I have the ability to, like, check up on them and see, like, their interviews and stuff, but Nora Roberts is one of those that I didn't start doing that until she really stopped really going out and doing events and things like that. So I actually don't know if she like did that on purpose or not. So Crack is very stereotypical, and or not even like super stereotypical, but he does things that I'm like, if we could offset this with other black characters who don't do this, I would feel a lot more comfortable about the fact that he's there. But then she does that in the next book. So, there's that. But I have to judge the book based on its merits alone. Now, the writing technique is fantastic, even for the 90s. I've noticed that like writing language, the word choice and the style for a lot of books has evolved a lot over the last like 10, 15 years. And I much prefer the way it is now. But even with that being said, the writing style of the first book, she carried over a lot of the poeticness that she used in her non-category romances. For the record, category romances are those like tiny little white and red books that you see on the shelf at Walmart, and then non-category romances are those romance novels that are like an inch thick and have like the super hot guys with their shirts open and have like interesting titles like Seduced by the Highlander. So she wrote a lot. First, she started off in category romance, and then she worked her way up to non-category, which is typically how it goes. And when she carried over a lot of her poetic writing style from the romantic novels that she wrote into her crime series, and I actually think that really actually worked out. It was very. It worked really well. I thought it made the writing very fresh. I thought that like the way things were described was really interesting and really new, and considering it was written in 1994, saying it was new is pretty interesting considering it's like 23 years old. So, but that being said, there's some things in it that I don't like. I think that the rape aspect could have maybe been written in a way that wasn't so violent. But then again, I know that Nora Roberts feels a certain way about the way the violence in her books is portrayed. She's very particular about that. That's one of the reasons she doesn't allow fan fiction, is because she does everything in a very specific way for a specific reason, and I don't know what that reason is. I just know that she does it. So because of that, I don't want to critique the graphicness of the violence just, with a blanket statement. I think it needs to be toned down. I think without the information on why she wrote it that way, I would like it to be toned down, but I'm not going to say that necessarily detracts from the book. That's a personal opinion. The only other thing that I have an issue with is, and I talk about this in a podcast I have called Consent in Romance Novels, is that there's a consent issue in the book, and it's not written as a consent issue. So there's a sex scene between Eve and Rourke where Rourke pins Eve's hands, and Eve says, "No, I can't." And Rourke looks at her for a minute, and he's about to, back off, and then he looks at her, and he's like, "You know what, never mind." And he doesn't say, "You know what, never mind," because he looks at her, and he's like, "You know what, she's too hot, I'm just gonna go for it." He looks at her and, sees something in her face that tells him that she's not saying no to the sex, she's saying no to something else, and it's something that is not an obstacle to them having sex. And it's a complicated thing, and it makes sense when you read it, but that's not the point. The point is that she said no. He's not psychic. He can't read her mind. He doesn't know for a fact what she's saying no about. We, as the reader, know what she's saying no about because this scene is from both of their perspectives. That's actually one thing that I thought was interesting, is they tell you not to head hop when you write, and most authors do not do this, but Nora Roberts did it, and it actually worked. And I was surprised that it worked, and I was surprised they let her get away with it. But so we as the reader, being able to see into both their minds, know what she's talking about, and Rourke, being quote-unquote intuitive or whatever, knows what she's talking. It's written that he knows what she's talking about, and what he's doing is okay when he continues to keep going after she says no. But that's not actually okay in real life. That would not be okay. And when I first read it, I didn't really think about it because I read a lot of romances, and that's in a lot of romance novels. That's not something that is considered unusual for romance novels for adults. And so I didn't even think about it at the time, and the reason I thought about it this time when I was rereading the book is because of 50 Shades of Grey, which that's a whole other conversation about why 50 Shades of Grey made me think of that. But the discussion about 50 Shades of Grey that's happening on the internet and stuff really has raised my awareness of the way consent is handled in romance novels, and the way it's handled in Naked in Death is the same, but the way that it's often handled in romance novels is not okay. And so I didn't like the way it was handled in Naked in Death either. Again, it's not written as a bad thing. Eve does not freak out about this. She does not get upset. She doesn't, and she's a police officer, so it's not like she couldn't, like, report him or arrest him. Because, like, later in another book, her attaché, who ends up becoming her partner, gets sexually assaulted, and Eve handles it the way that you would handle someone who got sexually assaulted. She's not one of those, well, you were asking for it types. So it's not something like that. It's just the way that this was written. It was written like it wasn't a big deal, like it wasn't anything unusual. And I think in real life, that would not be the case. If I said, no, I can't, I would expect my husband to stop and be like, okay, what's going on? If something was happening. I would want him to make sure that I wasn't, like, freaking out or having a flashback or suddenly was, like, feeling sick or something like that. I would expect him to stop and talk to me if I said, no, I can't. And I would expect that from any person that I was dating before I got married. I mean, like, before I got married, back when I still had a lot of issues with, like, ascertaining my rights about things like that, I wouldn't have said that. But now, like, if I had the same opinions now, if I had the same opinions back then that I did now, I would expect my boyfriends to back the fuck up if I said, no, I can't, when we were in the middle of, like, getting busy. So, that's, like, my biggest thing about the series. And that's not something that continues in the series, but there are other things about their relationship that kind of bother me, and, like, it works in the book. Like, the thing that bothers me about the relationship is their relationship works on paper, but in real life, I don't know that this would work for anybody except these two people. And it's not that it's, like, unrealistic, it's just weird. And I don't know how I feel about the fact that we have this, what would normally be a highly unrealistic and probably toxic relationship, but it's not toxic in the book. Like, I just don't know how I feel, because it's not. Like, it's a very healthy relationship for these two characters, but I don't think, like, if this was an experiment, if you wanted to recreate this relationship in the real world, I do not think you would get the same result. So that's, like, my only thing. But, yeah, so, anyway, so that's my review of Naked in Death. This isn't, like, full of yelling and screaming like some of my other reviews, because I actually really do like this book. It's just that there are certain things in it that really bother me, and I thought they were serious enough that I didn't want to be jokey about it. So, yeah. Again, I do recommend the series, but I do also warn people that the first book isn't very good. And also I don't have the excuse of this is her first book, because it's not. It's just the first book in the series. But, I mean, maybe she was like, part of it is that it's a product of the time. Part of it is, she was getting her feet under her in regards to crime novels. And part of it is I just don't think she realized based on, because the thing is, you learn how to write by reading what you're writing. So, like, if I want to write fantasy, high fantasy for teenagers, then, one of the things I'm going to read is, and learn how to write from, is Sarah J. Maas's Throne of Glass. And that could be a problem. And so, if you're writing a romance and all you're surrounded by is romance that deals with certain things in certain ways, that's all you know how to do. And so I think that is a big part of why the first book is not very good. But I also think she gets better as she goes on. I really do. I really like the series. And I'm still reading it, 20 plus years of books. There's more than 40 books, and there's like 7 novellas, and I've read almost all of them. I think I'm missing 2 novellas. And I'm anxiously waiting the next book. So that should tell you something. So yeah, like, comment, subscribe, let me know what you think. And this has been LA Knight with my review of Naked in Death by JD Robb. And I will talk to you guys later. Bye!